Okay, well, let's get started. Thanks for joining us for our Insight class today. We're going to be talking about the steps, the procedures to go through to get ready for the new year. It's right around the corner. So, when we talk about year-end maintenance, we're really looking obviously into the future, into the new year. One of the things to realize is that from a Stratum perspective, you don't really need to worry about prior years of history. That's certainly up to you in terms of how much you would like to maintain within Stratum. There's no requirement within the application as to the number of years of history that you can maintain within Stratum. We've got customers who have got 10, 15 plus years of history maintained within Stratum. It's just a choice that you make. There's no requirement, if you will, to, as with other applications, maybe to roll off older years of history and maintain current and 2 years back. There's no requirement like that within Stratum. So when we talk about getting ready for the new year, setting up what we need for 2020 and beyond, we can really break up the pieces of what we need to do into 3 sections. One is on the data storage side, making sure that we've got tables set up on Stratum Server to store the data for the new year. So we'll talk about that. And we also need, depending on your implementation, we need to define what we call the import calendar. And the import calendar is used to figure out, based on a transaction date coming into Stratum, which bucket, year and bucket, to put that data for Stratum purposes. Then there's another section on the view calendar, and that's really where a lot of folks spend a lot of their time getting ready for the new year. And that's where we talk about calendar bucket mapping, and we'll go into that obviously in more detail. And then the final section to get ready is making sure that that new data is going to be pulled over and imported into the viewer application, into the analysis services database that viewer uses. So before we get started, always recommend that certainly understand your calendar structure, especially if you're not a calendar-based fiscal calendar, January 1 to December 31st. Understanding how the fiscal calendar is set up. It may be 445. It may be some other mechanism or structure. So what I strongly recommend is making sure you got a spreadsheet or some other document that you can refer to as you're going through the process, especially the bucket mapping process, to understand what buckets of data within Stratum make up things like weeks and months and fiscal periods and quarters and things like that. And one of the pieces to that is to really understand for your different data sources, and data sources are things like your actual sales and your inventory, open orders, etc., which buckets are used for each category. Another thing to consider is how is the data actually stored within the Stratum Server databases. We've got some customers where the data is stored based on their fiscal year. Others, it's stored based on just a calendar year. The other thing to do is, before you get started, is to back up that Stratum Server database. There's a number of tables within Stratum Server that are used to maintain all of the calendar functionality that viewer uses. So just as a very simple Excel example that I've set up, I've broken it up by the different fiscal weeks within my calendar. And in the orange, I've got what buckets those correspond to. I've set it up so that in my example again, the green is a fiscal period for January in this example. Here's February down to March. And then on the light blue, I've got the calendar months. So when I go over to my data bucket mapping, it's very clear as to which buckets, the way the data is stored in Stratum Server, correspond to the different calendars. So as you can see in this example, defining calendar February versus fiscal February is a different set of buckets where the data is stored within Stratum Server. The calendar February being buckets 6 through 10, so 2/1 to 2/28. Fiscal February is bucket 5. It actually starts on January 28th in my example, down to bucket number 9, February 24th. Again, your calendar, your fiscal calendar, is completely different. But through setting up the Excel spreadsheet this way, I can very clearly see what buckets make up my fiscal weeks, my calendar periods, my fiscal periods, etc. So that's what I do to begin with. So now we're going to talk about that first step of the storage side of things. And we use the database install application that sits typically on the server, where your Stratum application is. And we've got two things to do in the database install. One is to define the tables, and that's where we actually set up for a particular structure code, like maybe actual sales. We want to create the new tables. In this example, it's for 2017. And we go ahead and say perform. And that's going to create the definition of the tables, both a header and a detail table. And then in that database install application, we're going to go down and we're going to select the create tables function. And that's where it's actually going to create those new tables for us. So now we'll have tables out there, header and detail, and we need to do this for every data source. So for your actual sales, your inventory, your open orders, POs, whatever you've got, we want to do that for each data source. The next thing we want to do, we're going to jump over into the admin application. And in admin, under the utilities menu, there'll be an option for the import calendar. Now again, the import calendar says, based on the date of the transaction being imported into Stratum, which bucket do I want to put it into? And that's done, again, by structure code. So in this example, I have actual sales. This defines for bucket number 1 of way back when, 2008, it's going to take anything from 1/1/2008 to 1/5/2008 and put that into bucket 1. From January 6th through the 12th, that's going to be put into bucket 2. So this is what Stratum Server on the import side looks at to figure out which time period or bucket to put it into the database tables. Now this is something that you'll need to look at your import process. In some implementations, especially those that have gone to daily buckets, daily time periods, we just use the day of the year for that and pass that along within the import process. Just something that you'll need to check. Okay, so now we get into the actual data mapping itself. How do we set up the calendars that the user sees within Viewer? So the first thing we want to do is we want to go into the admin application again. under Data Views and View Sets, clicking on the view set for year, and then View Items, and add that new year. So in this case, we're adding 2018. So this is going to show up in Viewer. Now we want to go to View Groups. Now View Groups are what show up as selections in Viewer as the time unit, how people want to see the data. So they can, in this example, for weekly, they can select fiscal month, months, weeks, and obviously year in Viewer. Now, we're going to see in a minute, the view group is associated to each of your data sources. And a view group could be used by multiple data sources, but you might have one for actual sales, which might be days or weeks, weekly. You might have a budget, which is just 12 periods. You might select a view group for months associated with that particular data source. How we identify that is within, again, the admin utilities. If you go over to the data source menu, you'll see down here at the lower left-hand side, this is the view group that's associated with this particular data source, DS-A1. Just another variation of sales. Okay, so that's how we know which view group is being used by which data source. Once we know that, then we can go into the view buckets for each of the different view sets within, in this case, the weekly view group. So in this example, I've got within the weekly view group, I've got these three view sets. I've clicked on fiscal month as the first one I want to select. And I do this by whatever year I want to create that view bucket mapping for. So I've created a new year, 2017. I want to now key in the information in the main portion of this window. So for a new year, and I select 2017, this will come up blank. And I'll now want to key in that bucket mapping from my Excel file that tells me for fiscal month January, it's from bucket number, in this example, 1 to 4. The bucket mapping start and end numbers, that tells Stratum or tells Viewer that when somebody wants to look at fiscal January, I need to sum up buckets 1 to 4. If they want to look at May, Viewer needs to sum up buckets number 21 and 25 to give them a total. Now the start and end dates you also want to enter. And what that does within Viewer, that tells Viewer, well, if I'm at a using some of the based time items that you can use, like current month or current fiscal period in this example, last period, next period. It knows based on the current date to go through the start and end to figure out where that current date falls. So if I happen to be, here, this last one. So I'm at November 14th is today. And I said, take the current period, current fiscal period. Viewer's going to look at the date range here. 11/14 falls between those. I want to display fiscal November to the user. So that's what the start and the end dates are used for. So from a recommendation standpoint, create that spreadsheet, or if you have a PDF document or whatever that shows you how these time periods are broken up. You want to start with that. Especially with the data mapping, you want to take your time. You want to make sure that as you're going through and you're defining that start bucket number, end bucket number, start date and end date, that you go through that and double check. Now, viewer in admin will help distinguish and find situations where you might have an end date that's before a start date that you specified, as an example, or the same thing with the buckets. So there's certain checks that we make within the admin functionality to check for those kinds of things. The other thing I would recommend is, as you're doing the data mapping, let's go back to here. After you've completed one of these view sets, so you've done all the data mapping, go ahead and click on the complete button here. And that's going to come back and it's going to say, whoa, wait a minute, you haven't finished yet because we have the other two, in this example, view sets to do. It'll ask you, do you want to complete those view bucket definitions? I recommend saying no, and it'll take you back to the screen that comes up before this. I don't have an example of that. But go ahead and say, save that information, okay? And that'll save it. Then go ahead and go back into that particular view bucket and select the next view set. Go ahead and do that. So I would come back in now and I would do months, and I would complete the data mapping for that. I do complete. I'd say, I know I got one more to do. I'll come back, say, no, I don't want to complete it yet. Save it, and then come back in and do the weeks. What I've seen is a lot of folks, especially if they have a lot of view sets, they'll try to complete all of them at one time, and one or two there'll be a mistake or something, maybe a data mapping that didn't go right, and they've lost quite a bit of work, potentially. You know, they may get frustrated or whatever and bail out, and they've lost all that work. So I find just doing it piece by piece, section by section, works out really well. Okay, so we've defined how to set up the tables to actually store the data. We've done the data mapping, and it's gone well because we've had our cheat sheet with us. And now the last piece to just make sure we get that data into viewer is two pieces. One on the pre-process side. You know, we've got those load OLAP processes where, depending on how you have it set up, and it can be different by implementation, but one of those is to make sure that we include that new year, 2020, into what we're loading up from a data perspective. Okay? Because remember, the load OLAP function makes sure that we've got all of the dimensional information available within viewer when we go to process the cube. And then finally, obviously, the other thing to make sure we do is to include that new partition or that new year in each of our measure groups or data sources. So in this example, you know, I want to click on that new year for each of my measure groups, and that'll bring in the data. Just a couple final thoughts. Can I be proactive and set up more than 1 year ahead? Absolutely. No problem with that. Really the only downside, and I put those in quotes, is that the users are going to see that in viewer. You know, if you go out 3 or 4 years ahead to set up your calendars, they're going to see those, and they can select them. Obviously, there's not going to be data for it. You may need to create future years for things like budgets or forecasts, especially forecasts, maybe even open orders, if you have open orders that are out in the future, you know, beyond 2020. You're going to need a calendar set up for those in order to be able to see those. And actually, also with fiscal years, if you have a fiscal year that starts in one calendar year and carries over, spans over into the next year, you're going to have to define both of those calendars in order to create that fiscal calendar.